Welcome to video number 1 of the SAT Grammar Bootcamp. In this video series, I'm going to go over not all of English grammar, obviously, because that's a huge topic and not really what we need for the SAT, but essentially the basics of grammar that you need to know for the SAT, the rules that come up again and again, and why they're rules. Now, on a few instances, I'm going to have to go into a little bit more technical detail about some grammar issues to give the groundwork or the foundation for some of the rules. But remember that what you really need to focus on is the particular rules that the SAT tests, and then how the SAT tests those rules. Because one of the important things to realize is that in certain instances, SAT grammar and real-life grammar, or at least the debates that people have about real-life grammar, can be two different things. So for the purposes of these videos, I'm just going to focus on what is important for the SAT. So very, very well could be a lot more detail, a lot more things to say about a lot of these grammar issues, and you know that's certainly interesting. But since we're just focusing on the SAT, we're going to be focusing on the issues that are important for that test only. All right, so let's begin in our first video just talking about nouns. So noun basics. What is a noun? Well, a noun is a word that names or represents a person, place, thing, or idea. And there are many different kinds of nouns. There's things like, abstract noun, concrete nouns. We don't really need to know the breakdown for that. The best probably the more important breakdown I can give you just for the purposes of the SAT would be a proper noun. And this is naming a specific person, place, thing, or idea. And this is where you get it capitalized. Examples of this would be, Bob, France, any kind of thing. Madison Square Garden, any specific noun. And in this case, you've got to capitalize them. And then you've got the rest of your nouns, which are your common nouns. And these are, tiger, person, freedom, right? Any kind of basic noun that's going to remain uncapitalized. So one other thing to mention, that this is a little bit connected to other issues, but I do want to introduce it now, and that is how a noun can be used in a sentence. And there's a lot of ways nouns can be used in sentences, so obviously I'm not going to be exhaustive here, but I just want to talk about the two really important ways that nouns can be used, especially for the SAT. The first and most important is as a subject, or as the doer of an action. Generally, that's what the subject is a doer. Now, of course, if we're talking about active voice or passive voice, and that's something I'll be discussing in a much later video, it's not always true that the subject is going to be the doer of an action, though, because you're going to see that in those cases they're kind of receiving an action to a certain extent, but we won't get into that now. Basically, for most of our sentences, the subject of the sentence, or the noun, is going to be the doer of an action. Or the beer of an action, if you want to put it that way. Right, so an example of a sentence like this would be, John loves Mary. In this case, John is a noun. It's a proper noun, but it's a noun, and it's the subject of the sentence. Sometimes you'll hear this called the nominative case, or at least not nominative, but this is the nominative. It's the subject of the sentence. So John loves Mary. Another example, a way a noun can be used, is as an object. So the receiver of an action. In this case, Mary is a noun, but it's the object, right? She is the object of John's love. There's actually two kinds of objects we can talk about. We can talk about a direct object, and this is when the noun receives the action directly. So if we, to make this a little violent, well, actually, let's just change the sentence. John hit Bob. In this case, Bob is the direct object because it's directly receiving the action that John is doing, the hitting. You can also, though, have an indirect object. And this is a noun that is benefiting from the action in some way, but is not directly being affected by it, or not directly being acted upon. So an example would be, John gave Bob the letter. So in this case, here's our subject, John, as a noun. We also have the letter, and we have Bob. Now the question is, which one's the direct object, which one's the indirect object? Well, the direct object is the thing receiving the action directly, and that in this case is the letter. So this is the DO, the direct object, because the letter is being given. On the other hand, Bob is also an object because he's kind of involved in this transaction. So he is going to be the indirect object because he is benefiting from the action, though it's not directly affecting him. So that's pretty much what we need to know for kind of this basic things about nouns. On the SAT, where will you see nouns come up in terms of errors? Generally, nouns on the SAT, nouns are not going to be wrong. Nouns will be right. Except for one example, which we'll talk about later, noun agreement. You'll see that in video number 3. So nouns will generally be right. They're not going to be tested directly on nouns, but we need to be able to recognize them, especially we need to be able to recognize the subject of sentences, as you'll see why later for subject-verb agreement in particular, but also for other examples. So nouns will generally be right, except for noun agreement, which we'll talk about. Another way nouns could be wrong is for wordiness, because sometimes too many nouns can make a sentence wordy, where you could just substitute in verbs or other expressions to make it a lot more concise. And one other thing we'll also discuss later, that kind of noun is a gerund, and gerunds can be abused and misused in sentences on the SAT, but we will talk about that in a later video. So that's it for Noun Basics. Next we're going to move on to collective nouns.